When using a compass, there are two things you need to know: magnetic north and your azimuth, which is the direction you need to go to reach your goal. In the United States, our political and moral compasses are off track, but it doesn't have to be that way. Come with me as I explore realistic options on how to improve our country. This is Off Azimuth. In 1978, Sir John Glubb wrote a controversial essay called The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. In it, he theorized that most historical empires lasted approximately 250 years. During that time, they go through several stages of development: ages of pioneers, conquest, commerce, affluence, and intellect, before culminating in a stage that marks the beginning of the end, that he called decadence. Decadence was characterized by, and these may sound familiar to most listeners, materialism, a welfare state, a defensive, pessimistic mindset, and what I think is most descriptive of the current situation, internal division. Historically, empires conquered and colonized. And though the United States wasn't a traditional empire in that sense, I would argue that the version of what an empire is has changed. For the past 100 years, the U.S. has been an empire of global influence. And in that regard, our empire is failing. And without a doubt, we are in the decadent stage of empirical decline. We are a nation divided. We are a country whose politics are no longer about representing the people of the United States, and instead exist solely despite the efforts of their rival political party. This is not a modern problem, even though it's gotten far worse over the past 60 years. This problem stems from a flawed premise going back as far as the 1790s, when our democratic republic emerged as a two-party system. Whether it was Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, or the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson opposed by the Whigs, the emergence of the Republican Party in the 1850s, to the political realignment of the Republican and Democratic parties of the 20th century, we have built our foundation on being a divided country, a country of us versus them. Admittedly, our political arena wasn't always this divisive. The two-party system has existed for nearly as long as the United States has existed. But to understand how we got to this point, we have to look back nearly 60 years, to the first term of President Nixon. In 1969, Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States. He inherited a United States that was struggling domestically and internationally. The country was embroiled in a war in Vietnam, a war that tested the United States military in ways it hadn't experienced previously. The U.S. military was exceptional at linear combat, where the enemy wore a specific uniform, and we battled against tanks and airplanes for land and air superiority. Vietnam represented something different. The enemy didn't have a uniform. They could, and often did, look like civilians. Rather than fighting against battalions of enemy troops, the U.S. was fighting against traps and ambushes. It was a war of attrition, and as those in the United States began seeing their loved ones, extended family members, and members of their communities coming home in coffins, public opinion began turning away from the war and the administration. This was the world Richard Nixon was set to inherit in 1969. But Vietnam wasn't the only international concern at the time. The fight against communism was the solitary focus of the United States, and had been for 20 years. It had only been 15 years since McCarthyism, the political witch hunt that saw many high-profile figures blacklisted for alleged, and I can't stress that word enough, alleged ties to communism. The 1960s were dominated by the space race between the US and the USSR, with the United States losing most metrics of the race, but culminating in the US being the first country to land astronauts on the moon. As though an interstellar conflict wasn't enough, President Kennedy had maneuvered the United States through the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, both attempts to thwart communism in the Caribbean. President Nixon understood that his presidency had to be focused externally. He sought inroads with both the Soviet Union and China, relationships that either hadn't existed or had been severely strained over the past century. But with his focus solely on the international stage, Nixon didn't have the bandwidth to be able to handle what he viewed as civil unrest within the United States. Media coverage of Nixon's first term was hardly flattering. The predominantly liberal media clashed with Nixon's conservative agenda. News articles highlighted Nixon's apparent disregard for the law. He authorized the FBI and CIA to monitor activists and people he perceived as personal opposition. Despite running on a campaign that emphasized the need to end the Vietnam War, within the first year of his presidency, he authorized Operation Menu, which involved bombing Cambodia. Nixon knew his popularity was a delicate balance, one that could easily tip against him. He needed someone to manage the internal distractions so that he could strengthen the U.S. position globally. He needed someone who could reinforce the belief that the Republican administration would do everything that the Democrats had previously failed to do. To handle these issues, he turned to his vice president and former Maryland governor, Spiro Agnew. In the 1968 election, Nixon only won the popular vote by less than 500,000 votes, which is less than 0.7%. Agnew understood that Nixon's success came from the Southern voters who were disillusioned with the Democratic Party. They held the Democrats responsible for embroiling the U.S. in the Vietnam War in the first place. And when nearly 15 million people gained educational deferments, the majority of which favored wealthier white families in the North, the silent majority of the South saw their service in the war as disproportionate. Despite winning the election, Nixon was inheriting this national vitriol against elected politicians. If the Republican Party were to maintain control during the congressional midterm elections and eventual presidential re-election, then Agnew needed to vilify those who opposed the president's policies. And when he couldn't find villains, he created them. He attacked major news networks, including ABC, CBS, and NBC, for bias against the president. He called them the liberal media elite, and claimed that they were controlled by a small, unelected group in Washington, D.C. or New York. He went after the anti-war protesters and dissenters, claiming that they had been trained by Fidel Castro and were paid for by unknown rich liberal intellectuals. That phrase, liberal intellectuals, was used often and freely to describe anyone who opposed the Nixon regime. They were immediately categorized as the wealthy elite who were out of touch with the common man. All his efforts were to segregate the nation into those who supported Nixon's Southern agenda and those who stood opposed to what he categorized as the will of the people. If that sounds familiar, it definitely should. His popular polarization is the blueprint for modern politics. Today, the parties call each other communists, racists, bigots, or radicals. Politicians discredit the media by calling them fake news. Historian Jill Lepore stated in her book, These Truths, A History of the United States, that Agnew was interested in using domestic policy to better divide his opponents. His commitment to making sure the American people didn't trust one another really was something distinctive. As early as October 1970, Agnew himself stated, "Dividing the American people has been my main contribution to the national political scene." And in that regard, Agnew was wildly successful. He didn't create the tension that had always existed between the parties, but he definitely exacerbated the problem. He started a movement of popularizing division between the two parties, something that would grow like a living organism as it threatened to dominate political discourse. Since the 1980s, the number of moderate members of both the House and Senate has plummeted. In the early 1990s, there were approximately 100 members of Congress that identified as moderate. In 2023, that number had dropped to only 14. The shift from moderate politicians to extremism is encapsulated in and a direct result of our two-party system. The two-party system is inherently flawed, and our founders warned us of this inevitability over 200 years ago. In George Washington's farewell address, he warned of the dangers of the two parties squabbling and how it would undermine our national sovereignty. He said, "However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to assert for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. And he wasn't alone. John Adams called the two-party system the greatest political evil under our Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton wrote that it was the most fatal disease of popular governments. Yet we fell into that trap anyway. We are struggling with internal division because we are now guilty of everything our founding fathers foresaw. Our political system is a cult of personality, where the parties exist to advance party agendas rather than listen to and represent the people. This divisiveness has led to 21 government shutdowns in the past 50 years. Bipartisanship has become a bad word, a stain that neither party will abide. In January of 2021, Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming, along with 9 other Republicans, voted to impeach former President Trump for inciting an insurrection because of the January 6 attack. Within weeks, she had been censored in an attempt to remove her from her Republican Party leadership position. When that failed, Republican lawmakers demanded she resign, that they would withhold any future political funding from her, and they called on her to repay donations to her 2020 campaign from the state GOP. They would successfully remove her from her leadership role in May that same year, and by August the next year, she would lose her state primary election, all because she voted against the Republican Party. In March of 2025, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer capitulated on a Republican-sponsored stopgap funding measure to keep the government open and operating. His actions were labeled as surrender and a profile in cowardice. Much like Liz Cheney, protesters and fellow legislators demanded he resign. House Speakers John Boehner and Kevin McCarthy, once seen as hardline Republicans, both resigned after receiving harsh criticism from their own party over the perception that they collaborated with Democrats. As the battle between the parties intensified, our politicians found new ways to weaponize their division. Never has that been clearer than in state gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the practice of manipulating district lines for political gain, such as taking a city stronghold and partitioning it into smaller, diluted pieces, or incorporating large rural regions into more densely populated urban areas. The problem is, as we piecemeal urban districts to dilute their vote in favor of Republicans, or annex large swaths of rural communities to strengthen Democratic positions, we are saying that the voice of the political minority doesn't matter. Gerrymandering has existed for as long as our two-party system. The name was coined in 1812, when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed an oddly shaped district that looked like a salamander, thereby creating a gerrymander. But modern technology has made the process more succinct, while also making insanely bizarrely formed districts. If you want to examine some of the worst examples, look up Salt Lake City, a Democratic haven, which was split into 4 sections to ensure all 4 congressional seats went to Republicans. Explore the Illinois' 13th District, which looks like the western edge of the state is trying to high-five Indiana on the eastern side. In 2025, the United States began weaponizing gerrymandering. The fear of losing or being unable to gain a majority in Congress led to infighting among the states. The Republican-dominated Texas redrew their districts, in effect eliminating 4 to 5 Democratic-leaning seats. In response, California voters overwhelmingly passed Proposition 50, which would convert 5 formerly Republican seats to Democratic ones. While California at least put theirs to a vote, the ends don't justify the means. The intent was not to properly represent the constituency. It was a political tool. Governor Newsom was very clear that Proposition 50 only came about as a response to the Texas gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has resulted in underrepresentation in Congress. That is the core of what is wrong with our political system. If a politician represents their party, then they're not representing the people. In the 2024 election, 43 congressional seats were won by a margin of less than 5%. That includes the Pennsylvania Senate race that was won by 0.22%, the Michigan Senate race that was won by 0.34%, the California District 13 race that was won by 0.09%, and the Iowa District 1 race that was won by 0.19%. If any of these politicians are pushing party agendas in Congress, they are willfully ignoring half of their constituents. Since I previously mentioned Texas and California, they'll be prime examples of this discrepancy. Texas has 38 seats in the House of Representatives. The current breakdown of those seats is 25 Republican, 12 Democrat, and 1 vacant. That gives a nearly 66% majority to the Republican Party. Yet in the 2024 election, Republican candidates received just over 5.2 million votes, to the Democrats' 4.1 million votes. By those numbers, Republicans should hold 54% of the congressional seats, or only 21 seats. The new redistricting makes the situation worse by giving 30 seats to the Republicans. In California, 43 of the 52 congressional seats are filled by Democrats, or approximately 82%. Compare that to the results of the House races in 2024, where 6 million of the 15 million voters cast votes for Republicans. That equates to 40% of the total vote, or 20 seats in the House, instead of the 8 they currently hold. When faced with our current political dilemma, it's understandable to feel overwhelmed, or even numb to vitriol and hatred. What can the common man hope to accomplish in the face of such divisiveness? There have been protests, but nothing has genuinely changed. People have flooded the phone lines of their politicians, but their representatives in Congress have remained staunchly loyal to their respective party messages, rather than entertain the concerns of their constituents. It feels hopeless, and we all feel helpless. When a nation is so blatantly divided, and parties are working against the best interests of the people, what hope is there for reconciliation? This is where I want off-azimuth to stand apart. I don't want this to be another platform where listeners have their hopes stripped away in the face of unfortunate truths. I want to offer solutions. Every episode will end with feasible, realistic options on how this can change for the better. Bear in mind, these ideas won't be easy to implement. We'd be faced with strong opposition, especially from those in power. But the power to change the government belongs to the people, not those in D.C. who cling to their facade of power like it's one of the last life rafts on the Titanic. So how do we fix the divisiveness that has infected our government? We fire Congress. I told you this wouldn't be easy, but if you bear with me, I'm going to walk through how we can revamp Congress to make a better representation of the citizens of the United States. The unfortunate truth is that when the Founding Fathers created the Constitution, they left no avenue by which a state could remove their representative or senator from office. Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution explains that the only means by which a congressperson can be expelled from office, a congressperson has to be fired by Congress. That's it. That's the only means that currently exists. If a representative or senator violates, and I quote, any law, rule, regulation, or other standard of conduct applicable to the conduct of the member in the performance of his duties or the discharge of his responsibilities, then a resolution to expel can be referred to the appropriate committee, either the Committee on Ethics in the House or the Select Committee on Ethics in the Senate. There is no addendum that allows a state to offer a vote of no confidence on a seated congressperson and recall them or replace them outside of the regular election cycle. If Congress represents the people, shouldn't the constituents have the ability to fire their representative? The problem lies in the fact that for laws to pass that create term limits or allow for the states to offer votes of no confidence on their congresspeople, the people that would write and pass those laws is Congress. They would have to vote against their own self-interests, and it's readily apparent that the majority will not support such measures. However, there is another option. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines the process for proposing amendments. The aspect of Article 5 that we're most familiar with is that new amendments can be proposed by a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate. But that isn't the only avenue offered in Article 5. It also explains that alternatively, amendments can be proposed by a national convention called by 2/3 of state legislatures. The framers' intent was to offer an outlet for states' rights, an avenue by which states could limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. If 34 states, or 2/3, proposed term limits in Congress, and 38 states, or 3/4 of the states, ratified the proposed amendment, then the states can theoretically bypass Congress and impose regulations that benefit the states while limiting the power of the federal government. Similarly, a constitutional convention of states could ratify an amendment that allows states to recall their legislative representation. But this is a band-aid on the sucking chest wound that has become our federal government. If a state recalls a representative, holds a special election, and nominates a replacement, what's to stop the cycle from continuing? What's to stop the next representative from getting elected by a 51% to 49% margin, and then pushing a party agenda while ignoring nearly half their constituency? Congress as it exists is an Ouroboros. It's a self-perpetuating system that only grows more divisive and polarizing the longer we allow it to continue. If we want to fix the problem, and not just treat the symptoms, we need to redefine representation in the legislative branch. We do that through a process called proportional representation. Proportional representation is a system by which constituents vote for party platforms rather than individuals. The percentage of votes statewide that a party receives, they gain that relative percentage of seats in Congress. To return to the previous example, in 2024, the Texas popular vote for congressional seats was 58.4% Republican and 40.4% Democrat. In a proportional representation system, the Republicans would have earned 22 seats, while the Democrats would have earned 16, as opposed to the current 25 and 12 respectively. That shift of 3 or 4 seats from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party is a more refined representation of the population of Texas. With the introduction of proportional representation, there would also not be a need for districts within the state. Gone would be the days of weaponizing gerrymandering in an attempt to silence the voice of a political minority. Districts in the House of Representatives are nonsensical. The representatives rarely propose or pass legislation that benefits their specific district over the state as a whole. In fact, there is not a law that requires a representative to reside within the district he or she represents. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution defines the requirement to be elected to the House as such: be at least 25 years old, have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years, be an inhabitant of the state they represent when they are elected. There is no constitutional requirement that the representative live within their district. That qualification was challenged by the states who intended to impose residency requirements. In the 1995 case, U.S. Term Limits Incorporated versus Thornton, the Supreme Court confirmed that the requirements listed in the Constitution are fixed and exclusive. States could not legally require a representative to live within their specific district to hold office there. In an ideal world, state legislatures would be responsible for receiving federal funds and petitioning for their respective districts. That shouldn't be a responsibility of the federal government. Proportional representation does more than just better reflect the political landscape. It also gives rise to independent parties. In the 2024 election, third-party and independent candidates received 2.13% of the vote, totaling over 3 million votes. While those numbers were inconsequential to the outcome, it reflects a not insignificant percentage of the U.S. population that is not represented in Congress. At least 3 million people whose voices are not heard. There is a stigma in the United States that voting for a third party or independent candidate is the equivalent of throwing away your vote. Louisiana political scientist Pearson Cross explained the process of voting for third parties as essentially withholding a vote from one of the major candidates, rather than supporting the independent party. Regardless, independent parties still hold power. Leading up to the 2024 presidential election, articles by USA Today and The Hill expressed Democratic concerns that if they were unable to recruit prominent third-party candidates like Jill Stein or Cornel West, that they feared they could take away votes from Kamala Harris's campaign. The might of the independent parties peaked in the 1992 election. Ross Perot, a wealthy Texas oil tycoon, ran as an independent candidate whose platform focused on fiscal responsibility and government reform. He received approximately 18.9% of the popular vote, or roughly 19.7 million votes. Despite that, he received none of the Electoral College votes. His campaign was seen as both a voice of disenfranchised voters and detraction from the campaigns of both George Bush and Bill Clinton. In January 2026, Gallup polls interviewed more than 13,000 adults. Their results showed that voters identifying as independent or third party reached an all-time high of 45%. This is attributed to voters becoming disillusioned with the two-party infighting and no longer feeling aligned with the more far-left or far-right rhetoric. One of the largest factors is attributed to younger generations of American voters leaning disproportionately towards being politically independent. Similarly, older generations, primarily Millennials and Generation X, continue to identify as independents at relatively high rates as they've gotten older. Enabling proportional representation would give rise to the establishment of valid and supported third parties, and most importantly, give these parties a say in our federal government. If 40 to 45% of voting Americans identify as independent, but don't vote as such because of a lack of support in our political landscape, then we owe it to them to give an outlet for proper representation. Furthermore, an increase in independent and third-party representatives in Congress would break any one party's ability to hold a supermajority, or an ability to push through legislation without requiring support from the minority party. A separation of power from the two-party system would force both the Democrats and Republicans to come to the table to negotiate. It would break the chokehold both parties currently hold, where might is right, and the party platform trumps constituent needs. This system exists throughout the world. Approximately 90 countries utilize some form of proportional representation in their electoral system. Countries like Sweden have used this form of representation since 1907, and in the intervening 100-plus years has refined their process. Not all small parties in Sweden receive seats in their parliament. A party must receive at least 4% of the popular vote to earn a seat. However, as of 2022, 8 parties are represented, with the Social Democrats holding the largest majority at 30%, or 107 of the 349 available positions. This distribution, a party holding a majority at something as low as 30%, forces parties to collaborate with one another or form coalitions in order to create a majority capable of getting political proposals through the legislative branch. The bipartisanship that slowly died over the past 50 years would become commonplace once again, as no party could push through legislation without compromise. Proportional representation is not without its flaws. Allowing broad representation of all political ideologies results in giving voice to a small but loud minority. The Nordic Resistance Movement Party in Sweden, registered as a political party in 2015, is considered a central actor in Sweden's white power movement. Despite only receiving 0.03% and 0.01% of the votes in 2018 and 2022 elections respectively, they still appeared on ballots as a viable third party. No political system is perfect, but the two-party system of the United States is deeply flawed. There is no way ahead with the current system. Protests haven't worked. Calls to politicians have fallen on deaf ears. When the people feel that there is no outlet by which their voices can be heard, then they will likely choose violence. We don't have to go back too far in history to see examples of this. The Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, or even 250 years ago, when 13 colonies no longer felt that their best interests were being represented by the people tasked to govern them. Either we decide to tear it down using the Constitution, or it gets torn down by force. The power now lies in the states, and you, the citizens of the United States. You hold the power to enact change, whether it be by enforcing term limits, eliminating districts within the House of Representatives, or introducing proportional representation to the U.S. federal government. Change comes when the citizens of the United States expect higher standards for their elected officials, and if the federal government is unable or unwilling to vote against their self-interests, then it falls on the state legislatures to push through amendments enforcing the very change we want to see. Our country's moral compass is currently off azimuth, but there's still hope that we can realign our politics back towards a magnetic north. Thank you for tuning in.